Hi there guys, I hope you are having a good day. Grab yourself a cup of tea and let's talk some boxing. Now, let's continue our fight talk for fight week between Joseph Parker and Derek Chisora. This is going to be a great fight, but it also has an undercard. And one of those fights on the undercard is Chris Eubank Jr. versus Marcus Morrison. Now, I'm interested to see where Chris Eubank Jr. is, especially since Chris Eubank Jr.'s last fight against Korobov, and let's be real, that fight didn't end in the best way for Eubank or for Korobov because no one really wants to win a fight that way. Second round, he got an injury. So he hasn't had all that many rounds, and I think that the last time he went 12 was against James DeGale, and that was in 2019. It has been a while since he got some quality rounds in the boxing ring, and it is important that he gets those rounds. I believe that that is what they are looking for in Marcus Morrison, someone who might be able to take him at least to the mid stage, and someone who will have a trade up with him. I mean, Marcus Morrison seems to believe that he has the power to stop Chris Eubank Jr., so therefore he's going to engage, and we will see an entertaining fight. Morrison's going to give it all he's got nothing to lose and everything to gain, so therefore we will see a very entertaining matchup on May 1st. Now, Chris Eubank Jr. was talking about the fact that he could fight Gennady Golovkin, and he believes that he can match him for power and he can outwork him. Now, of course, that has been a fight that has been long touted for Chris Eubank Jr., but one that he missed out on due to the fact that Kell Brook faced him instead. I mean, that was supposed to be Chris Eubank Jr. in that fight, but there were so many stipulations that were trying to be put in place by Team Eubank, or at least that is what Eddie Hearn said, and that meant that they just went with the option of putting Kell Brook in there as opposed to Chris Eubank. And I do believe that there was some talks being held about Kell Brook versus Chris Eubank Jr. Now that would be an interesting fight, but Callum Sauerland said they did explore it, it didn't come off, and now he fights Marcus Morrison. But it is clear his sights are set on Gennady Golovkin, and they have been for a while. I believe that where Gennady Golovkin is getting to the tail end of his career, that does give Chris Eubank Jr. a little bit more of a chance in that fight, because I think that Gennady Golovkin a couple of years ago would have been too good for him. I think that Chris Eubank Jr. does need to plot his path though. He cannot just go from Marcus Morrison to Gennady Golovkin, because I think that we've seen him do that before where he's gone from one level to another. He does jump levels, and the problem with doing that is he doesn't have the in-between fight to get there, and I just think that he's done that multiple times during his career. When he gets to that certain level, he really struggles. When he stepped up against Billy Joe Saunders, he came unstuck, and it was down to inexperience and perhaps a lack of boxing ability at that time in his career that really cost him. And the same kind of happened with George Groves. He stepped up and again really struggled in that contest. I mean, George Groves completely outboxed him. So Chris Eubank Jr. does need to build towards something, and during this stage of his career, he's at a point where he can go either way. He needs to choose the right path, and that is important for him to ensure that he has the right promoter, the right team behind him to get him to the place he wants to go. Marcus Morrison is the start to that, and I think that we can expect to see a good contest. I don't think we can expect Marcus Morrison to beat him. I would be quite surprised if he came anywhere close, but still, that's no disrespect to Marcus Morrison. He got the opportunity, got the call and took it, so it is a great chance for him. But for Chris Eubank Jr., it is just another fight. It is the big fight for Marcus Morrison, and you know, that is what makes him dangerous in some capacity. Now, I do think that Chris Eubank Jr. needs to look at who he faces next, but he needs to sort out Marcus Morrison first. So he is looking at Gennady Golovkin, but in my opinion, he's not fighting Gennady Golovkin this year, or at least he shouldn't be, unless it is at the very end, and he gets another fight in between after fighting Marcus Morrison. I believe that perhaps a David Lemieux would be a good opponent for him. Then step up again, then he's ready for Golovkin. You have to wonder as well, what does Golovkin get out of facing Chris Eubank Jr.? Jr. needs to get himself in the position that could warrant Gennady Golovkin taking that challenge. I mean, he's going down the WBA route anyway. He has the WBA Interim World Championship, and I believe that Murata has now been upgraded to WBA Super Champion, so there is the possibility he could get that fight after Marcus Morrison, so a world title opportunity after the Marcus Morrison fight. If not, then it could be someone like a David Lemieux, then go for that world championship. So it's quite incredible that Chris Eubank Jr. could be fighting for a world title this year, given his position in the WBA rankings. He might even end up getting an opportunity to fight for the WBA regular vacant title, but I don't really see the point in that. Why not just give him the opportunity to face the full champion if he is number 1 in those WBA rankings? So I'd rather see him fight for the Super Championship against Murata rather than fight in a vacant world title fight, because I don't really see the point in that for Chris Eubank Jr. I mean, it is a world title at the end of the day, but still, if he's number 1, he's going to want to fight the champion who currently holds the Super Championship, which is Murata. So that should be the route that Chris Eubank Jr. gets, given he is number 1 in those rankings. With that being said, let's move on to his training situation. We have Roy Jones Jr. travelling over to be in his corner for this fight, and that does show you that this is significant for Chris Eubank Jr. to get him back on the right path. And I think that Roy Jones is a good trainer for him, because Chris Eubank Jr. needs someone he will listen to, and therefore he needs someone he ultimately respects, so that he will listen. Roy Jones Jr. is that person, and I believe that he can do great things with Chris Eubank Jr. As I said, it's not just about a trainer who knows what they are talking about, it's about a trainer who Chris Eubank Jr. will listen to. That is extremely important, and he definitely will with Roy Jones Jr. because let's remember, primarily throughout the early stages of his career, he was kind of training himself, especially around his world title opportunity against George Groves. So that done him no good whatsoever. At this stage, he is the fighter he is, but things can be tweaked and things can be subtly adjusted here and there. But that does not mean he can change completely. He is the fighter he is. He's learned the things he's learned. Mistakes also along the way. The only thing that Roy Jones can do is try to rectify some of those mistakes, and perhaps we will see a different kind of performance against Marcus Morrison. But I don't really want to see Chris Eubank Jr. go in there looking to box off the back foot, looking to be smart. I don't really want to see that because that's not him. He is a fighter who has a great volume of punches, a great punch output, and I want to see that in this fight. I don't want to see a different Chris Eubank Jr. trying to be something he's not, because he can't do that. When he gets to the top level, he will come unstuck, because those guys have a style that they have been perfecting over the course of their career for years, whereas Chris Eubank Jr. is someone who has a style, but has adapted and changed, gone to something else. So what he can do is take what he has as a base level, then build on that, so make himself a better version of Chris Eubank Jr., not make himself, say, Chris Eubank Jr. 2.0. Anyway, I'm excited to see what he brings on Fight Night. Guys, anyway, what are your thoughts on this? Make sure you leave your thoughts in the comments below, also leave a like and grab that subscribe button. Thanks guys.